Everyone, my name is Rachel and this is my Equity Action Plan. So just a quick overview, we're going to go over what multicultural education is. I'm going to ask some questions, then we're going to go over the action plan, measurable goals, equity literacy, and some obstacles and solutions. So first, what is multicultural education? Nieto and Bode quote, that multicultural education is a process of comprehensive school reform and basic education for all students. It challenges and rejects racism and other forms of discrimination in schools and society and accepts and affirms the pluralism that students, their communities, and teachers reflect. Multicultural education permeates the school's curriculum and instructional strategies, as well as the interactions among teachers, students, and families in the very way that schools conceptualize the nature of teaching and learning. Because it uses critical pedagogy as its underlying philosophy and focuses on knowledge, reflection, and action as the basis of social change, multicultural education promotes democratic principles of social justice. So multicultural education has 7 characteristics. It is anti-racist education. It is basic education. It is important for all students. It is pervasive. It is education for social justice, and it is a process and a critical pedagogy. So these are just some questions I thought of when writing my action plan on how to promote inclusion and equity in the classroom. How inclusive is the media you consume personally and professionally? How inclusive is your curriculum? How inclusive is your classroom library and mentor text? How inclusive is your language? How inclusive are the class discussions that you have? How do you model inclusive thinking to your students? How often do you discuss inclusive practices with your colleagues? So for my action plan, I will create an educational environment that provides inclusive curriculum and instructional strategies that is rooted in social justice and includes students' cultural references in all aspects of learning, because every child deserves an education that guarantees the safety to learn in the comfort of their own skin. And at the bottom, I have a quote from Nieto and Bode about monocultural education, and I believe that my action plan will do the opposite and will combat monocultural education. So the 3 goals that I have: the first, students of all backgrounds are visible in all aspects of curriculum. Multicultural education pervades the curriculum, instructional strategies, and interactions among teachers, students, and the community. It can be seen everywhere. All courses are completely multicultural. The second is that social justice is central to education. The curriculum and instructional techniques are based on an understanding of social justice as central to education. Reflection and action are important components of learning. The community's concerns are evident in school activities. And the third, students and teachers use critical dialogue. Education is both content and a process. Students and teachers ask questions like why and how, and the knowledge of and sensitivity to students of all backgrounds is apparent. Students' experiences, cultures, and languages are used as a source of their learning. And I will measure these by 3 components. The first, I will measure that curriculum is designed to represent all students by the student's ability to connect with the material, as well as incorporating multiple narratives and perspectives in all coursework. I will give students opportunities for seeing how positive change happens and how they can be both actors and leaders in creating change. I will teach my students about making positive change in the world by connecting with them, discussing real-world problems and multiple perspectives, creating classroom community, and including authentic assessment in order to measure understanding. I will measure critical dialogue by using a problem-posing method to promote critical thinking and encourage students to ask questions around challenging and uncomfortable questions. Next, we're going to dive into equity literacy. And just as an overview, equity literacy is an important aspect in the classroom because it is an instance of maximizing the integrity of transformative equity practice. So this means that not being lulled by popular diversity approaches and frameworks that pose no threat to inequity. Equity literacy helps us to ensure we keep a commitment to equity at the center of our work and conversation. So the first principle we're going to talk about is the direct confrontation principle, where there is no path to equity that does not involve direct confrontation with inequity. There is no path to racial equity that does not involve a direct confrontation with interpersonal, institutional, and structural racism. Equity approaches that fail to directly confront inequity play a significant role in sustaining inequity. And I will combat this by evaluating my teaching materials for bias and adjusting materials accordingly, and having literature from different cultures and ethnicities and time periods available for free reading. The next is the equity ideology principle. Equity is more than a list of practical strategies. It is a lens and an ideological commitment. There are no practical strategies that will help us develop equitable institutions if we are unwilling to deepen our understanding of equity and inequity. And I will combat this by creating a physical environment that affirms differences, emphasize unity through human similarities to reduce racism, prejudice, and discrimination, emphasize cooperative learning, and foster critical thinking in the classroom. The next is the one-size-fits-few principle. No individual identity group shares a single mindset, value system, learning style, or communication style. Identity-specific equity frameworks almost always are based on simplicity and stereotypes, not equity. So I will combat this by familiarizing myself with basic cultural differences. I will use a communication style that is consistent with the values of students, cultures. I will welcome parent volunteers into the classroom. I will ask students to share their personal experiences, and I will include second language learning in the classroom for all students. So one of the first obstacles that we may face would be poverty of culture detour. And this is where racism is a power and oppression issue, not a culture issue. We might attempt to solve these disparities by adjusting the behaviors, mindsets, or emotions of students of color rather than by adjusting educators' racial presumptions or schools' inequitable practices, said Gorski. So the solution to this would be to change the prejudices and biases of teachers in schools, to look at the policies that are in place that perpetuate racial inequity, change those practices, and change the practices that focus on fixing students of color rather than fixing the conditions that marginalize them. The next obstacle that we may face is the ideology detour. Presuming we can resolve racial inequities by simply teaching students of color to have grit is like presuming we can resolve climate change by teaching coastal communities to swim faster. I really liked this quote specifically because I feel that it talks about how we ignore racial inequity by focusing equity efforts on programs designed to adjust the mindsets, cultures, values, behaviors, and grittiness of students of color, instead of looking at where the responsibility should fall, which is on teachers and schools to create a learning environment that promotes the success of all students and also recognizes the systemic injustices that these students face. So the solution to this is that equity initiatives should focus on eliminating conditions that marginalize students, never on fixing students of color. If we cannot describe how our efforts are eliminating those conditions, it's time for an equity overhaul. And the third is celebrating diversity detour, which is a focus on celebrations that help white or privileged students learn about culture without confronting racism. This allows white people to opt out of considering racial justice while deriving social and cultural benefits from diversity awareness. It creates the illusion of diversity appreciation while entrenching inequity. The solution to this is that it is important that students feel heard and understood. Personal experience and perspective are key to learning about culture. If a teacher does not identify with a specific culture, it is not their place to teach about it. Allowing students to share their stories firsthand promotes an authentic representation of that culture. Using a variety of resources that provide authentic narratives and allowing students to use their personal testimony to tell their stories creates genuity. So in short, this is what I came up with as like my definition of multicultural education. Multicultural education is predicated on the principle of educational equity for all students, regardless of culture, and it strives to remove barriers to educational opportunities and success for students from different cultural backgrounds. Multicultural education is basic education. And these are my resources. So for the first, I have Affirming Diversity by Nieto and Bode. Then I have Principles for Equity Literacy by Paul Gorski and Avoiding Racial Equity Detours by Paul Gorski. Thank you so much for listening.